They came in the middle of the night. No warning, no explanation. Just a knock on the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on wooden floors and an NKVD officer reading a single sentence from a sheet of paper. "You are being evacuated. Pack immediately." For millions of Soviet Germans, farmers, teachers, soldiers, children, this sentence marked the end of everything they had ever known. Families who had lived in Russia for more than 170 years suddenly found themselves accused of treason. Villages that had survived famine, civil war, and revolution were emptied in a matter of days. Entire communities vanished, loaded into unheated cattle cars, and sent thousands of kilometers east into the frozen edges of the Soviet Union. But here is what almost no one was allowed to know. This was not a desperate wartime reaction. This was not a spontaneous act of national panic. It was a pre-planned, carefully designed operation, drafted in secret long before Nazi Germany ever invaded the Soviet Union. A blueprint hidden in sealed files, guarded by the NKVD, and buried for decades. Behind the public decrees and patriotic posters, Stalin had already decided the fate of more than 1 million people. And the real story, how the Soviet state prepared to erase an entire ethnic group from its European territory, would remain classified until the 1990s. Tonight, we open those files. This is the untold history of one of the largest forced deportations of the Second World War. A story of fear, paranoia, intelligence reports, sealed archives, and the quiet destruction of a people who had no idea they were being watched. This is WW2 Declassified, and today's investigation, Stalin's secret plan to deport every Soviet German. To understand why Stalin targeted an entire ethnic group for removal, we must go back nearly 2 centuries, long before the NKVD, long before Stalin, long before the Soviet Union itself. Back to a time when the Russian Empire was still expanding, and when its rulers sought skilled settlers to tame the vast, empty frontier stretching across the Volga steppe. In 1763, Empress Catherine the Great, a German-born ruler of Russia, issued a manifesto inviting Europeans, especially Germans, to migrate east. She offered extraordinary privileges: exemption from taxes, religious freedom, self-governance, and, most importantly, exemption from military service. Tens of thousands accepted the offer. They established villages along the Volga River, each with its own Lutheran or Catholic church, its own schools, and its own German dialects. Over time, these communities became known as the Volga Germans, and they did exactly what Catherine hoped. They brought advanced agricultural skills, boosting local food production, and stabilizing regions long plagued by poor harvests. By the mid-1800s, German settlers were no longer newcomers. They were firmly rooted in Russian soil. They had built farms, factories, and schools. They had survived wars, invasions, and revolutions. When the Soviet Union was created, these German communities were seen not as outsiders, but as contributors to the new socialist society. That recognition became official in 1924, when the USSR created the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, a semi-independent region with its own government, its own cultural institutions, and, for a time, a sense of security. This was extremely rare. Stalin's government rarely allowed ethnic autonomy. Granting it to the Germans was a sign of trust, or at least political convenience. But the 1920s did not last, and neither did the trust. By the early 1930s, Stalin's paranoia had begun to reshape the Soviet Union. Ethnic groups with ties beyond Soviet borders, Poles, Finns, Koreans, Latvians, were suddenly branded potential enemies. Mass purges began. Borders were sealed. Foreign languages became grounds for suspicion, and hovering above it all was Adolf Hitler. As Germany grew more aggressive in Europe, Stalin and the NKVD began asking a dangerous question. Could Soviet Germans one day serve as a German fifth column, a hidden internal enemy? There was no evidence for this. None. In fact, many Soviet Germans were loyal communists. Some served in the Red Army. Some held positions in the party. But Stalin's logic was never based on evidence. It was based on eliminating risks before they became threats. By 1935, NKVD field agents were quietly documenting every household where German was spoken, every citizen with a German surname, every German in the military or the Communist Party, every family living in the Volga German Republic. Officially, these surveys were labeled census improvements. In reality, they were the first drafts of a removal plan. As Europe drifted toward war, suspicion deepened. German language textbooks vanished from schools. German cultural institutions were slowly dismantled. Propaganda films began portraying foreign elements as traitors waiting for instructions from abroad. But the most ominous shift came after 1939, when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact brought temporary peace between Germany and the USSR. Publicly, the Soviet government reassured its citizens, especially the Germans, that they were safe. Privately, NKVD planners interpreted the pact differently. If Germany ever turned on the Soviet Union, and Stalin believed it might, millions of ethnic Germans lived in territory that could quickly become a battlefield. The NKVD concluded that these people were strategically vulnerable and potentially politically unreliable. That was the moment when quiet suspicion became concrete planning. When NKVD memos first used the phrase relocation of the German population from European territories, a phrase that would 2 years later explode into one of the largest forced deportations of the Second World War. Between 1939 and 1941, the Soviet Union existed in a state of quiet dread. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had given Stalin temporary breathing room, but no one in the Kremlin believed peace with Hitler would last. German troops were sweeping across Europe with terrifying speed. Poland had fallen in weeks. France collapsed in months. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies over Western Europe. To Stalin, Hitler's power was not just a distant threat. It was a force that could reshape the entire world. As German armies moved eastward, Stalin began to see shadows everywhere. He distrusted diplomats, commanders, foreign communists, and even his closest advisors. But above all, he distrusted minorities with cultural, linguistic, or ancestral ties to countries beyond the Soviet border. The NKVD, under Lavrenti Beria, fed this paranoia. By 1940, internal NKVD reports warned, if war breaks out between Germany and the USSR, ethnic Germans may become a mobilized asset of the enemy. This statement had no factual basis. German Soviet citizens had never demonstrated disloyalty. Many were factory managers, teachers, and party members. They lived far from borders. They had no contact with Germany. Yet in Stalin's mind, potential disloyalty was equal to treason. And so, the surveillance intensified. The NKVD created ethnic risk maps, marking each German village, each farming community, each German language school. Secret field agents were instructed to assess political reliability based on rumors, personal grudges, or mere suspicion. Some officers even fabricated reports to appear vigilant. Meanwhile, Soviet propaganda subtly shifted. Newspapers began describing fascist agents hiding among innocent people. Films portrayed foreign-looking characters as conspirators. Public speeches emphasized internal vigilance. The message was clear: danger could be anywhere. In late 1940, NKVD headquarters drafted what would later become the foundation for mass deportation. The draft, labeled secret, not for distribution, outlined complete removal of Germans from the Volga region, breakup of German agricultural communes, arrest of unreliable German intelligentsia, redistribution of German-owned land to Russian and Ukrainian settlers. These policies were not yet approved, but the framework existed. Quietly, trains were identified. Railway routes were proposed. Command posts were assigned. Entire logistical operations were mapped out, long before the German invasion. At the same time, a separate fear grew inside the Soviet General Staff. If the Germans attacked, the Volga region, home to hundreds of thousands of Soviet Germans, sat along a supply chain critical to Soviet industry. The NKVD warned that any sabotage, real or imagined, could devastate wartime production. This concern was repeatedly overstated, but Stalin believed every word. In early 1941, tension gripped Moscow. Intelligence reports indicated German troop buildups along the Soviet border. Defectors warned of an imminent invasion. Soviet agents in Europe sent increasingly urgent messages. Stalin ignored these warnings publicly, but privately he panicked. He demanded updated population data for the Volga German Republic. He asked about German party members. He requested lists of German officers in the Red Army. Beria delivered all of it, compiled into thick red leather-bound folders stamped with one word: classified. These were not the actions of a government improvising under threat. These were the actions of a government preparing for a decisive internal move. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. German troops stormed across the Soviet border, crushing entire divisions in days. Soviet panic exploded. But for Stalin and the NKVD, the invasion did not create a new policy. It activated one that was already waiting. The Soviet Germans, many of whom volunteered to fight, many of whom spoke no German at all, were no longer seen as citizens. They were now labeled a security threat. And the NKVD moved with chilling precision. The German invasion of June 1941 sent shockwaves across the Soviet Union. Cities fell, armies collapsed, and millions fled eastward in desperate attempts to escape the advancing Wehrmacht. In the chaos, Stalin moved swiftly, though not against the military, not against failing commanders, but against a target already chosen long before the war: the Soviet Germans. On August 12, 1941, a secret Politburo meeting was convened. Beria presented intelligence claiming that German civilians within the USSR were preparing an uprising to assist the Wehrmacht. These claims were fabricated, stitched together from rumor, speculation, and deliberately falsified NKVD reports. No uprising existed. Not a single verified act of sabotage had been committed by Soviet Germans. But Stalin didn't need evidence. He needed justification. 16 days later, August 28, 1941, the Soviet government issued one of the most consequential documents of the war, Decree No. 21-160, the liquidation of the Volga German ASSR. Accompanied by the operational directive NKVD Order No. 35/05, it spelled out in cold, administrative language the fate of more than 400,000 people living in the Volga region and eventually over 1.2 million across the USSR. The decree accused Soviet Germans of conspiring with Hitler, stating, "Among the German population are thousands of saboteurs awaiting orders from Berlin." A claim unsupported by any documented evidence. The decision had been made. And now the machinery of the Soviet state turned toward execution. NKVD units, trained for mass arrests and deportations, received sealed envelopes. Inside were lists of German households, pre-mapped transport routes, orders to complete evacuations within days, instructions for confiscating property, pre-written arrest warrants for suspected collaborators. The operation began before dawn. Across the Volga German Republic, NKVD trucks rolled into villages, headlights off. Officers entered homes without knocking, reading from prepared scripts. You are being evacuated to protect you from the advancing enemy. You must comply immediately. Families were given 30 minutes to 2 hours to gather belongings. Most thought it was temporary. Most had no idea they were being permanently exiled. While families were being rounded up, a parallel operation unfolded. Government offices in the Volga German ASSR were shut down. Soviet administrators replaced local councils overnight. German language schools were closed. Teachers dismissed. Churches were sealed or repurposed for military use. Within 72 hours, an entire autonomous republic, created over decades, ceased to exist. Maps were redrawn. Borders erased. The Volga German ASSR vanished from official Soviet atlases. Once removed from their homes, German families were marched to rail stations under armed guard. Witnesses described long columns stretching for miles, elderly villagers carried on carts, children clutching the few possessions they could hold. At the stations, the reality became clear. These were not passenger trains. They were freight trains, wooden cattle cars used to transport grain, livestock, or timber. Each car held 40 to 60 people, with no insulation. A hole in the floor for sanitation, little to no food, a single water barrel. For some trains, the journey east took 3 to 5 weeks. Entire families died before reaching their destination. The NKVD recorded deaths mechanically. 1 deceased. Cause, fatigue. 2 deceased. Cause, unknown. Bodies were removed and buried near tracks. Sometimes the train didn't stop. The Volga region was only the beginning. Throughout late 1941 and into 1942, Stalin expanded the operation. Ukraine. 350,000 Germans deported Crimea. 60,000 deported Caucasus. 90,000 deported Siberian German communities, forcibly relocated further East German Red Army officers, stripped of rank and east removed. In total, over 1.2 million Soviet Germans were uprooted. The official term for the operation was evacuation. Inside NKVD documents, the real term appeared: deportation of unreliable national elements. One of the most chilling aspects of the deportation was its quiet efficiency. Wartime chaos allowed the NKVD to work without scrutiny. Newspapers published no details. Radio broadcasts said nothing. Even local Soviet citizens often did not know where their German neighbors had gone. The state erased an entire population almost overnight. And just as rapidly, new settlers, mostly Russians, were moved into former German homes, fields, and offices. Farms changed hands. Villages were renamed. Cemeteries were bulldozed or repurposed. The erasure was not just physical. It was cultural. It was historical. It was deliberate. When the trains finally reached their destinations, Kazakhstan, Siberia, the Altai region, the Ural Mountains, Soviet Germans discovered the second phase of their ordeal: exile, forced labor, surveillance, permanent displacement. They were not told when they could return. They were not told if they could return. For many, the deportation was merely the beginning of decades of suffering. By the time the deportation trains reached Kazakhstan, Siberia, the Altai Mountains, or the frozen stretches of the Ural North, the deported Soviet Germans had already endured weeks of hunger, sickness, and death. But for many, the real suffering had not yet begun. The NKVD didn't relocate them to cities or established settlements. They were sent to the most remote, undeveloped regions of the Soviet Union, places chosen specifically for their harsh climate, labor needs, and political isolation. The official term given to these areas was special settlements. In practice, they were exile zones. Upon arrival, families were registered, photographed, and issued internal passports marked with the designation Spetsposelenets, special settler. This label stripped them of basic rights. They could not leave the settlement without written permission. They had to report to NKVD commandants weekly. They were forbidden to travel, vote, or change jobs. Curfews were imposed. Violations carried prison sentences of 5 to 10 years. Homes did not exist when they arrived. Settlers often slept in animal sheds, unfinished barracks, or dugouts carved into the earth. Winter came quickly. Temperatures in some regions dropped below 40 degrees Celsius. One survivor wrote, "We had 2 blankets for 9 people. The wind came through the walls. My brother froze in his sleep." Food rations were minimal. Villagers survived on millet, frozen potatoes, and whatever they could forage. Many died during the first winter of exile. NKVD commandants kept meticulous logs. Every settlement had a file listing: births, deaths, illnesses, productivity infractions. If a settler failed to report for work, even once, it could be classified as desertion, punishable by arrest and transfer to a Gulag camp. Entire communities lived under constant threat. Yet this was only one part of Stalin's plan. A second, far more brutal mechanism was about to be unleashed. In late 1941, NKVD and labor ministry planners realized that the Soviet war machine required massive manpower. Millions had been drafted. Industrial centers were overwhelmed. Mines and factories were dangerously understaffed. The solution, from the regime's perspective, was simple: use the deported Germans. The Trud Armee, translated as Labor Army, was born. Unlike the Red Army, this was not a military force. It was a system of forced labor battalions created specifically for ethnic groups deemed politically unreliable. German men aged 17 to 50 were the first to be drafted. Then the age limits rose. Then women were taken. Then teenagers. By 1942, entire German villages in exile were emptied of working-age adults. NKVD trucks arrived, names were read aloud, and those drafted into the Trud Armee were transported to labor sites across the Soviet interior. Conditions were indistinguishable from the Gulag: 12 to 14 hours of work per day, minimal food, primitive barracks, armed guards disease, and injury with no medical care. Labor Army members were sent to coal mines in the Urals, oil fields near Baku, logging operations in Siberia, railroad construction in the Arctic North steel, and aluminum factories critical to wartime production. The official Soviet claim was that this was labor mobilization for wartime needs. But internal documents used harsher language: mandatory labor of unreliable nationalities under NKVD supervision. The death rates were staggering. Some camps saw mortality reach 20–30% during the harshest winters. One eyewitness recalled, "Every morning, 2 or 3 bodies were carried out of the barracks. We buried the dead in shallow graves before going to work." The Trud Armee was not a temporary measure. Even after the German army retreated, forced labor continued. For many, this system lasted years. For some, more than a decade. When the war ended in 1945, survivors of the Trud Armee expected to return to their families. Many dreamed of going back to their home villages in the Volga region. But the Soviet government had other plans. Instead of allowing them to go home, the NKVD extended the special settlement regime. Germans remained exiled, monitored, and restricted. Entire families were told they were not allowed to leave Kazakhstan or Siberia. The Volga Germans realized the truth. Their homeland no longer existed. Their republic had been erased. New settlers occupied their former homes. Their churches, schools, and cemeteries were gone. They were not deportees waiting for return. They were a people erased from the European Soviet landscape. By 1948, Stalin issued another decree. Soviet Germans were forbidden from returning to their pre-war lands indefinitely. For many, exile became permanent, and the story remained hidden. The world did not learn the full extent of their suffering because the Soviet state ensured their voices were silenced. But after Stalin's death, the truth began to leak through the cracks. When the Second World War finally ended in May of 1945, the Soviet Germans who had survived the deportation trains, the exile settlements, and the Trude Army believed their nightmare might be coming to an end. The German army was defeated. The threat that Stalin had used to justify their removal had vanished. In their minds, the logic was simple. If the war was over, perhaps they would be allowed to return home. But they soon discovered that the war had never been the real reason for their suffering, and that home no longer existed. The NKVD informed returning labor army survivors that they were not free citizens, only temporarily released workers. They were ordered to report back to the special settlement commandants, the same offices that had processed their exile years earlier. Men and women who had endured years of forced labor now learned that their movement remained restricted. Their identity documents remained stamped with the mark of suspicion, and their status had not changed. Stalin issued a new decree in 1948 that made the truth undeniable. Soviet Germans were forbidden, indefinitely and without review, from returning to their former lands in the Volga region or any of the European territories from which they had been taken. What they once knew as home was officially closed to them. The Soviet government quietly erased the Volga German Autonomous Republic from maps, textbooks, and public memory. Its former administrative buildings were repurposed, its schools reopened under different names, and Russian settlers were moved into German houses the moment they were emptied. Entire cemeteries were destroyed or absorbed into agricultural fields. Churches became warehouses or storage barns. The cultural footprint of the Volga Germans, built over nearly 2 centuries, dissolved almost overnight. In the eyes of the state, the Republic had not been deported. It had been rewritten out of existence. Inside the Soviet Union, the story became a taboo. Citizens were discouraged from asking questions. Newspapers never mentioned the deportation. School children who asked why the Germans had disappeared from certain regions were told that the subject was closed. Even those who lived alongside the deported Germans in Kazakhstan and Siberia rarely knew their full history. The deportees themselves understood the danger of speaking openly. A careless remark could provoke interrogation. Many carried the fear of the NKVD long after the organization changed its name and leadership. Meanwhile, Soviet archives carefully controlled the narrative. Internal NKVD reports that documented the mass removal of Germans were marked top secret and locked away. Wartime memos blaming the Germans for sabotage were preserved, while contradictory evidence was either buried or destroyed. For decades, historians outside the Soviet Union had only fragments of information, scattered memoirs, whispered testimonies, and occasional second-hand references in obscure Soviet publications. The true scale of the deportation was impossible to verify. The Soviet state had built a wall of silence around one of its largest wartime crimes. It wasn't until the late 1950s, during Khrushchev's period of limited reform, that pressure mounted to reconsider the exile regime. Some groups deported during the war, such as the Chechens and Kalmyks, were eventually rehabilitated and allowed to return to their homelands. But the Germans were excluded. Officials claimed that their former republic had been administratively unnecessary, a vague and politically convenient phrase that concealed the deeper truth. Their exile was not the result of military necessity, but the consequence of a long-standing ideological suspicion. Only after Stalin's death did the rigid surveillance begin to loosen, yet the restrictions remained in place for years. Many Soviet Germans lived their entire lives in Kazakhstan or Siberia, unable to return to a homeland many of their children had never seen. Some made attempts to return illegally, only to be arrested and sent back into exile. Others tried to rebuild their lives where they were, forming new communities that carried the fragments of their culture forward. For decades, the world remained largely unaware of what had happened to them. The Soviet Union presented itself as a triumphant, unified force that had defeated fascism, and its internal purges, deportations, and forced labor systems were kept out of sight. The suffering of the Soviet Germans did not fit the wartime narrative the Kremlin wanted to show the world, and so the truth remained buried, sealed inside archives that scholars were forbidden to open. It would take the collapse of the Soviet Union for the truth to finally surface. But even then, the scars left behind were far from healed. When Soviet archives finally creaked open in the early 1990s, researchers, survivors, and descendants of the deported Germans were confronted with a truth more chilling than they expected. Decades of silence had hidden a plan that was not born from the chaos of 1941, but from decisions quietly made in the offices of Stalin's inner circle long before the war had erupted. Historians studying the newly revealed documents found pre-war maps, lists, and memoranda that laid out the steps for the removal of the German population, long before Hitler's armies crossed the Soviet border. The deportation had not been a panicked wartime measure. It had been a strategic blueprint. For the descendants of the exiled, this revelation was both a confirmation and a wound. Families that had grown up in Kazakhstan, Siberia, and Central Asia now learned with certainty that their ancestors were never meant to return. The Volga German homeland, once vibrant with schools, churches, and villages echoing with centuries of tradition, remained absent from modern maps. Attempts to restore the Volga German Republic were discussed during the Gorbachev era, but quietly dismissed, as the demographic landscape had changed beyond recognition and political interest was minimal. What remained instead were the stories, some passed down in whispers, some lost forever. The legacy of the deportation shaped millions of lives. Soviet Germans who emigrated to Germany in the late 20th century carried with them memories of exile, forced labor, and the erasure of their cultural identity. Those who stayed in Kazakhstan or Russia tried to preserve fragments of their heritage, dialects, songs, recipes, photographs, small pieces of a world taken from them before they were born. In some villages, elderly survivors still recount the day the NKVD arrived, the night the trains left, or the winter when entire families disappeared. Today, historians view the deportation of the Soviet Germans as one of the largest and least acknowledged ethnic cleansings of the Second World War. Unlike other tragedies of the era, this one remained hidden behind the Iron Curtain, overshadowed by the vast scale of the war's violence and the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazi Germany. But the opening of the archives revealed that even as the USSR portrayed itself as liberator, it committed its own acts of mass displacement and destruction inside its borders. The story of the Soviet Germans forces us to confront a difficult truth. Authoritarian regimes do not act only in moments of crisis. They prepare, they calculate, and they execute plans long before the world sees the consequences. The deportation was not an accident of war, nor a side effect of panic. It was an intentional act of state power designed to reshape the ethnic landscape of the Soviet Union according to Stalin's vision of security and control. Even today, the memory of the Volga German Republic lingers like a ghost. There are no restored borders, no reconstructed towns, no monuments standing where entire German communities once lived. But in the testimonies of survivors, in the faded letters carried across continents, in the declassified documents stamped with the red seals of the NKVD, the truth endures. It reminds us that history can be buried, rewritten, or silenced, but it cannot be erased forever. And that is why stories like this matter, because they force us to look beneath the surface of official narratives, to question what governments hide, and to recognize the human cost buried within classified files. The deportation of the Soviet Germans is not just a historical episode. It is a warning about the fragility of civil rights, the danger of unchecked power, and the ease with which entire populations can disappear under the weight of state secrecy. This has been WW2 Declassified, exposing the histories the world was never meant to see. If you want more untold stories, lost operations, and buried wartime secrets, make sure to follow, subscribe, and keep watching. And if there's a hidden chapter of World War II you want uncovered next, leave a comment below. Your suggestion might be the next declassified investigation.